Sicily, July 11th, 1943. A dusty ridge outside a town called Gela. The sun is already brutal, and the air smells of scorched grass and diesel. A young American paratrooper presses himself flat against the warm dirt. He is 19 years old, maybe 20. His hands are shaking, and he tells himself it is the heat. It is not the heat. Down the slope, through the shimmer, something enormous is moving. He feels it before he sees it. A low, grinding vibration that climbs up through the ground and into his ribs. Steel tracks chewing stone, an engine the size of a small truck. Then it rolls into view, gray and vast and armored, a German tank grinding straight toward his position. He has no artillery. He has no anti-tank gun. He has a metal tube, open at both ends, balanced on his right shoulder. It looks like a length of stovepipe. It looks like a joke. He does not run. He waits. He lets the monster come closer, closer, until the flank of it fills his sight. And then he squeezes the trigger. Here's the thing nobody expected. The tube on that boy's shoulder cost about $19 to build. The tank in front of him cost the equivalent of a small fortune, and it carried a crew of 5 trained men. And yet, in that single second on a Sicilian hillside, the cheap little tube won. This is the story of a weapon so simple it was named after a comedian's homemade novelty horn. A weapon the army almost did not bother to make. A weapon that, in its first real battle, embarrassed everyone who touched it, and then became one of the most feared sounds a German tank crew could hear. For most of military history, the foot soldier and the tank were not a fair fight. They were barely the same species. When the first tanks crawled across the mud of the First World War, infantry discovered a horrible truth. A man with a rifle against a moving wall of armor is not a soldier. He is a spectator. Bullets sparked off the plating and went nowhere. The tank simply kept coming, and there was almost nothing an ordinary rifleman could do about it. By the late 1930s, the problem had gotten worse, not better. Tanks were faster now, thicker, meaner. Armies knew they needed a way to stop them, so they built anti-tank guns. And those guns worked, but they came with a cruel catch. To punch through armor, you needed velocity. To get velocity, you needed a big gun. To move a big gun, you needed a heavy carriage, a team of men, and often a truck to tow the whole thing into place. Picture what that means for the man on the ground. The tank can appear anywhere. It can come around a hedge, over a rise, out of a tree line, in the time it takes to light a cigarette. But your defense against it weighs hundreds of pounds and takes minutes to set up and aim. The tank moves like a predator. Your anti-tank gun sits there like a piece of furniture. The math does not work. The enemy always gets to choose the moment, and the moment is almost never when your big gun happens to be pointed the right way. Armies tried to shrink the problem down to something a single man could carry. They gave soldiers anti-tank rifles, which were basically enormous rifles firing enormous bullets. Against the thin armor of the early 1930s, they did something. Against anything modern, they were nearly useless. They kicked like a mule, they were long and clumsy, and by the time the war got serious, tank armor had simply outgrown them. The infantryman was right back where he started, alone, on foot, watching a machine roll toward him that he could not stop. What the foot soldier needed was almost a fantasy, something light enough for one man to sling over his shoulder and run with, something he could aim and fire in seconds, from a ditch, from a window, from behind a wall, and something that, despite weighing almost nothing, could still gut a tank. On paper, those requirements fought each other. Light and deadly did not go together. Everyone knew that, almost everyone. The answer did not come from a huge weapons factory. It came from a much stranger place. It came from a shaped charge and a scrap pile. To understand why the bazooka worked, you have to understand the trick at its heart. It is called a shaped charge, and it does not rely on speed at all. That is the whole secret. A normal anti-tank gun defeats armor with brute force by throwing a solid slug so fast that it smashes through. A shaped charge defeats armor with geometry. You take a cone of metal, you line it with explosive, and when it detonates, the blast collapses that cone into a thin, screaming jet of molten metal moving faster than a rifle bullet. That jet does not smash the armor. It bores through it like a needle through wax and sprays fire and shrapnel into the crew compartment on the other side. The beautiful part for a foot soldier is this. A shaped charge does not care how fast it was traveling when it hit. It does its work on contact, which means you do not need a giant high-velocity gun to deliver it. You just need to get it to the tank and make it stick. Suddenly, light and deadly could go together after all. The man who put the pieces together was an Army officer named Colonel Leslie Skinner, who had spent years believing a rocket weapon for infantry was possible when almost no one else did. He had the shaped charge warhead. What he did not have was a way for a single soldier to launch it. That final piece came from a young lieutenant named Edward Uhl. Uhl told the story himself years later, and it is almost too simple to believe. He was trying to figure out how to protect a soldier from the backblast of the rocket, how to give the man something to aim through, and he was walking past a scrap pile. Lying there was a tube of metal that happened to be exactly the right diameter for the rocket they were building. In his own words, he looked at it and thought, that is the answer. Put the tube on a soldier's shoulder, slide the rocket inside, and away it goes. The launcher was, quite literally, a piece of scrap that happened to be the right size. They tested it at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland in May of 1942. The early sights were reportedly bent out of a wire coat hanger, and the crude little thing worked. It fired a rocket carrying a shaped charge warhead that could bite through several inches of armor. It weighed only around 13 pounds, empty. One man could carry it. One man could fire it. The impossible requirements had been met by a tube, a rocket, and a very good idea. And the name, that ridiculous immortal name. The launcher looked, to the men who first saw it, like a homemade musical instrument played by a popular comedian of the day, a fellow named Bob Burns. Burns had built a silly horn out of 2 pipes and a whiskey funnel and called it a bazooka. Someone took one look at this new weapon, all tube and awkward angles, and said it looked like Bob Burns's bazooka. The name stuck. The most feared infantry anti-tank weapon of the war was named after a joke instrument built for laughs. If you are enjoying this, a quick subscribe helps the channel keep making them. Now here's where the story refuses to be a simple fairy tale. Because the bazooka's first taste of real war was not a triumph. It was closer to a disaster. The weapon's combat debut came in November of 1942 in North Africa during the Allied landings known as Operation Torch. This should have been the bazooka's grand entrance. Instead, it barely showed up at all. The launchers had been rushed to the troops so fast that, incredibly, almost no one had been trained to use them. Men were handed a strange metal tube and a rocket and left to figure it out under fire. General Dwight Eisenhower himself was reportedly stunned to learn how few of his soldiers had ever actually handled the thing before the landings. It got worse in the fighting that followed, in Tunisia. The early rockets were unreliable. In the heat and the dust, they misfired, or failed to go off, or simply did not do what they promised. By the spring of 1943, the situation was so bad that according to accounts of the campaign, there was no confirmed report of the bazooka actually stopping a German tank. Think about that. The wonder weapon, the tube that was going to save the infantry, and in its first campaign, it could not point to a single dead tank it could truly call its own. And then came one final indignity. The Germans captured some of these bazookas on the battlefield. They took the crude American tube back to their engineers, studied the shaped charge idea, and were impressed enough to build their own, bigger version. So, in its opening act, the bazooka failed to kill tanks and accidentally handed the enemy a blueprint. If the story had ended there, the bazooka would be a footnote, a good idea that flopped, but it did not end there. Because the Americans did something the clone weapons rarely get credit for. They fixed it. The unreliable early rocket was improved. The launcher was refined. Crucially, soldiers were finally trained on how to use the thing properly, in teams, at the right range, aiming for the right spots, and the next time the bazooka went to war, it was a different weapon in different hands. The improved model reached the fighting in Sicily in the summer of 1943, and this time the results spoke for themselves. In that campaign, the bazooka was credited with destroying 4 German Panzer IV medium tanks, and in the streets of a town called Biscari, it was even reported to have knocked out one of the feared Tiger tanks. Now, honesty matters here, because accuracy is the whole point. That Tiger kill is a reported result, not an ironclad certainty, and you should hold it as exactly that. The Tiger was a monster, and a small-caliber bazooka defeating one from the front would have been extraordinary. What almost certainly happened when bazookas did beat heavy tanks is that the soldier did the smart and terrifying thing. He let the tank pass, or he stalked its flank, and he put his rocket into the thinner side or rear armor, where even a modest-shaped charge could reach the crew. That is not a knock on the weapon. That is the weapon being used exactly as it was meant to be used. Up close, from an angle the enemy did not expect. From Sicily onward, the bazooka came into its own. It went ashore in the hedgerows of Normandy after D-Day. It fought through France, through Italy, through the freezing forests of the German border. And it changed something fundamental about how it felt to be a tank crewman. Consider what the bazooka did to the psychology of armored warfare. Before it, a tank rolling through infantry was a god. The men scattered, and the tank did as it pleased. After the bazooka spread through the ranks, every hedge, every ditch, every second-story window, every pile of rubble became a possible ambush. A single unremarkable soldier, someone the tank crew would never even see, might be crouched there with a $19 tube and the power to turn their steel home into a furnace. The tank was no longer a god. It was a target that had to worry about the little men. There's a story that captures the sheer nerve the weapon demanded, and it comes from the Rangers fighting in Italy. In brutal close-quarters combat, Ranger teams used bazookas to destroy German tanks that came grinding toward their positions, sometimes stopping 3 armored vehicles that pushed in on them, even as machine gun fire tore through their ranks. To do that, you have to understand what firing a bazooka actually asked of a man. The weapon had a violent backblast, a sheet of flame and smoke that erupted from the rear of the tube when it fired. That backblast announced your exact position to everyone on the battlefield. So the bazooka man got, at most, 1 good shot before the enemy knew precisely where he was. 1 shot. Then he had to move or die. Let that settle for a moment. Somewhere out there, a 19-year-old is lying in a ditch, holding a tube, waiting for a 40-ton machine to get close enough that he cannot possibly miss, knowing that the instant he fires, he lights a beacon over his own head. That is not a weapon for the timid. It never was. And then there was the man who decided the bazooka should fly. His name was Charles Carpenter, a former history teacher turned artillery spotter, and the soldiers called him Bazooka Charlie. Carpenter flew a tiny, fragile, unarmed observation plane, a little Piper aircraft made of fabric and wood. His job was to circle over the battlefield and radio back where the enemy was. Carpenter decided that was not enough. He bolted bazookas to the wing struts of his little plane, wired the triggers into his cockpit, and then dove that flimsy aircraft down at German armor and fired. During the fighting in France in the autumn of 1944, Carpenter was credited with knocking out German tanks from the air with those strapped on bazookas. A history teacher, in a plane made of cloth, hunting tanks with the infantry's stovepipe. The weapon inspired that kind of madness because it made the impossible feel briefly, gloriously possible. So how did the bazooka actually stack up against the enemy? Here we have to be fair, because the honest comparison is more interesting than the myth. The Germans, remember, had captured the bazooka and built their own. They did not just copy it, they made it bigger. Their version, nicknamed the Tank Terror, used a warhead considerably larger than the American original, and it could punch through more armor. By the raw numbers, the German copy was the more powerful weapon. If you lined the two up on a test range and measured penetration alone, the student had beaten the teacher. It is important to say that plainly, because pretending otherwise is exactly the kind of flattery that rots history. The British, too, had their own answer to the tank, a strange spring-loaded device that hurled a bomb a short distance and required nerves of iron to operate. It worked, in its own peculiar way, in the hands of extraordinarily brave men. But here's what the American bazooka had that mattered just as much as penetration. It was light. It was simple. It was produced in staggering, overwhelming numbers. Across the war, American factories turned out hundreds of thousands of these launchers and many millions of rockets. The bazooka was not the most powerful shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon of the war. The enemy's copy could out-penetrate it. But the bazooka was everywhere, in enough hands, cheap enough and simple enough that an ordinary rifle squad could carry the power to kill a tank as a matter of routine. Sometimes, the weapon that changes a war is not the one with the best numbers on a chart. It is the one that shows up by the 100,000 in the hands of the man who needs it. The bazooka had its limits, and it is only fair to name them. As the war went on, German tanks grew thicker skins, and the small American rocket struggled to defeat the heaviest armor from the front. Later, in Korea, against newer tanks, the little 2.36-inch bazooka was finally outclassed for good and had to be replaced by a much larger successor. No weapon stays king forever. But for the years when it mattered most, the bazooka gave the ordinary foot soldier something he had not truly had since tanks first appeared: a fighting chance. Let us go back to that ridge outside Gela. Back to the 19-year-old paratrooper, flat in the dust, the German tank grinding toward him, the stovepipe balanced on his shoulder. Remember what he was holding: a tube of metal that cost about $19, a weapon named after a comedian's joke horn, a weapon that had flopped in its first battle, been captured by the enemy, and copied into something stronger. And remember what he did with it. He waited. He let the monster come. And with one squeeze of the trigger, that cheap little tube reached out and did the one thing a foot soldier was never supposed to be able to do. It stopped the tank. That is the whole strange miracle of the bazooka. It was never the biggest weapon on the battlefield, or the most powerful, or the most feared on paper. It was simply the one that put the impossible into an ordinary man's hands. And in war, as in most things, it is not always the loudest or the strongest that decides the day. Sometimes it is just the one who was there, holding the tube, when the monster came close enough.